Hello and namaste to all of you. Today in UPSC GS series, we are doing sustainable development unit 8.1, that is environmental dimensions of globalization. In this unit of sustainable development, we will do introduction, that aims and objectives of environmental dimensions of globalization. Point to changing nature of the globalization, that is role of technology, role of trade, role of finance capital, global climatic change. Point 3, globalization and environment, that is free trade and environment, terms of trade and environment, environmental standards. Point 4, global environmental interventions, that is globalization and sustainable development, globalization and large scale disruption of the ecosystem, some global environmental initiatives, summary of the unit 8.1, and at the last, glossary of the words that were used in this unit. General instruction for the students are the same, that they have to listen the audio very carefully and note down 10 words from this audio number 24 in their notebooks, and by intuition they have to think about these words and the meaning and uses in this audio of these words and why they are important. They also think about it. Introduction of the several overwhelming issues that have come to the fore during the last 2 decades of the 20th century. Two issues that stand out prominently are globalization and global change. Globalization has several connotations. Globalization in general terms is a much wider phenomenon encompassing all aspects of global spread, ranging from culinary skills, cultural practices, languages, political ideas and ideologies, to migration of people, flow of technology, trade, labor, and investments as well. In general, globalization means something that affects the whole world. Here we are concerned with its specific form and phase. We are more concerned with economic globalization that has been underway since early 1980s. It has been a process of globalization of production and rapid liberalization of trade and investment flows. The present phase of economic globalization has certain dimensions fraught with environmental implications, which we shall discuss in this unit. Global change refers to certain environmental changes that impact the nature at the global level. For instance, climate change can no longer be seen as a national or a regional problem but as a global phenomenon. The underlying causes of climate change, like greenhouse gas emissions, are as much related to national energy policies as to the process of economic globalization, but the solutions ought to be found through global institutional interventions. These aspects shall be dealt with in the last part of this unit. Aims and objectives. Aims, after listening this audio, we should be able to, number one, explain the nature and process of present economic globalization as well as global environmental change, and number two, discuss the impact of the present phase of globalization on environment and appreciate the need for appropriate global environmental interventions. Point 2, changing nature of the globalization. Economic globalization is associated with worldwide expansion of capital as an integral part of the capitalist development. There are evidently epochs of more rapid global expansion and extension of capital. These epochs are termed as globalization. For instance, we can identify two such epochs. Number first, globalization of 1860 to 1914. 1860 to 1914, the widely acknowledged imperialist colonialist phase, and second, globalization since 1980. We deal here with the later part of the epoch. The present phase of economic globalization, which has its beginnings in the early 1980s, is seen as a determined removal of all barriers to and rapid increase in the flows of trade, investment, services, and even intellectual property rights across the borders. Under the aegis of present globalization, capital in all its forms, productive and portfolio, has been moving freely across nations, apparently challenging their sovereignty. However, the same may not be true in the context of labor mobility, which is still impeded by restrictions. In that sense, there is continuous debate with regard to the role of the nation state, whereas some perceive globalization as a process of minimizing the power of states and nations. Others see states playing a more proactive role for achieving the goals of globalization and even to protect the interest of the people of the periphery. 2.1 Role of technology. The previous phase of globalization 1860 to 1914 has driven by the drastic fall in transport costs brought about stream by the steamship and railways. The current phase is driven to a large extent by information and communications technology (ICT). The average cost of processing information fell from $75 per million operations to less than a hundredth of a cent in 1960 to 90. Airline operating costs per mile came down by half in 1960 to 90. The cost of a 3-minute telephone call from New York to London fell from $2.45 in 1930 in 1990 prices to under $50 in 1960 to $3 in 1990 to about 35 cents in 99. The present phase is also characterized by a leap in the share of world trade. The world exports averaged 21% of GDP in the 1990s compared to the 17% of the GDP in the 1970s. Point 2.2 Role of trade. Globalization since early 1980s has accelerated the growth rate of the world trade at a much faster pace than world output. The ratio of world trade to world gross domestic product increased from 10% in 1970 to about 20% in 1998. The growth of capital and financial flows has been faster than the growth of world trade. Foreign direct investment reached $400 billion in 1997, 7 times the level in real terms in the 1970s. Portfolio and other short-term capital flows have grown substantially and now totaling more than dollar trillion dollars, almost 3 times more than those in the 1980s. 2.3 Role of finance capital. The current phase of globalization is characterized by the nature of financial markets and the rapid increase in gross financial flows. Daily global transactions in currency alone increased from $15 billion in 1973 to $2.12 trillion in 1995. Currency flows are totally disconnected from the phenomenally greater than trade and investment flows. This suggests an increased speculative trading in currencies. This phenomenal increase in currency flows is also related to huge leap in portfolio investment. Cross-border transactions in bonds and equities by the United States investors increased from 9% of the GDP in 1980 to 164% in 1996. Such hyper-financial markets have heightened have heightened financial and economic instability, particularly in the third world centuries. Short-term flows have only added to the risks of volatility. These changes, unleashed by the process of the present economic globalization, have serious environmental repercussions, which we shall discuss in the next part of this unit. 2.4 Global Climatic Change. While discussing the process of economic globalization in its relationship with environment, it is essential to understand the phenomenon of global change, or more precisely, global climatic change. From the early 1980s, there has been a growing concern about global warming. Research findings show that there has been an increase in the atmospheric concentrations of greenhouse gases (CHGs) that cause greenhouse effect, which results in global warming. The greenhouse effect is a process in which energy from the sun, solar radiation, passes through the atmosphere freely, but the heat radiated back from the earth is partially blocked or absorbed by gases in the atmosphere. The radiation absorbed by clouds, carbon dioxide, and some other gases produce the greenhouse effect, and hence the warming of the atmosphere. The additional warming sets off a chain of changes like glacial melting, rise in the level of the sea, erosion of coastal ecosystems, all of which are the causes of the concern to all of us. Gases like carbon dioxide, methane, nitrous oxide, chlorofluorocarbons, CFCs, are called greenhouse gases, CFGs. Carbon dioxide is responsible for over half the enactment of the greenhouse effect. CFCs that contain chlorine and bromine are known to cause depletion of ozone layer, which in turn increases the incoming ultraviolet radiation. This results in the increase of skin cancers. The CHGs that trap the outgoing long wave radiation have been increasing. Though natural events also contribute to these gases, substantial emissions are due to increasing human activity caused by industrial emissions, vehicular emissions, burning of forests and refrigerations, etc. It is estimated that the global mean surface temperatures would be about 2 degrees Celsius above the pre-industrial levels by the year 2030 and about 4 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial levels by 2090. As a result of the rise in global temperature and melting of glaciers, the sea level is projected to rise between 9 cm and 29 cm by 2030 and 28 cm and 96 cm by 2090. Significantly, adverse effects on small island states and low-lying deltas such as those in Bangladesh, Egypt, and China could render millions of people homeless, and the warning the warming would cause significant loss of life. Heat stress, mortality, and disease could increase as the tropical habitat of insects expands northwards. Substantial part of the emissions of CHGs is the contribution from the industrialized countries. The present phase of economic globalization, with more attention to economic growth, based on the so-called strategies business as usual is bound to aggravate global warming. In the developed countries, the level of production, especially in energy and transportation sectors, have reached a point where there is need to emphasize reduction in the per capita energy use while paying for the carbon and other sinks largely associated with biodiversity and forest cover of the poorer countries. Global climate change necessitates globally negotiated agreements and institutions for implementation. We shall, the discussing, we shall be discussing these issues at the end of this audio. Point 3, Globalization and Environment. In the context of the environment, we shall discuss different aspects of globalization such as free trade and terms of trade and environment. Besides, it will be imperative for us to discuss standards of the environment. 3.1, Free trade and environment. The recent trends in globalization of production and steep reduction in all barriers to allow free flow of trade and investment are opposed by many environmental groups all over the world. They perceive globalization as harmful to environment for the following reasons. First, free trade is seen as a means of more output and income, which means more resource depletion and degradation of the natural environment. Second, freer trade, investment, and globalization of production will lead to increase in transport activity and encourage the relocation of environmentally degrading industries to countries with lower environmental standards or more fragile natural environments and thus contributing to further environmental damage. Third, freer foreign investment reduces the incentive to develop environmentally friendlier technologies. Fourth, free trade may result in industrial and agricultural reorganization to capture large markets. This might involve larger productive units, factories that are aesthetically unpleasing and farms that remove hedgerows and use intensive agricultural techniques. Fifth, free international trade neglects the environment in the same way as domestic free markets fail to account for environmental losses. In other words, trade liberalization can be expected to increase market failure. 3.2, Terms of Trade and Environment. The World Commission on Environment and Development, Brundtland Commission 1987, viewed that world commodity trade frequently encourages resource depletion in the developing world. The proportion of increased volumes of commodity exports has led to cases of unsustainable overuse of the natural resource base, while individual cases may not fit this generalization. It has been argued that such processes have been at work in ranching for beef, fishing in both coastal and deep sea waters, forestry, and the growing of some cash crops. Moreover, the prices of commodity exports do not fully reflect the environmental costs to the resource base. Further, the Brundtland Commission also draws attention to the possible consequences of increases in trade to primary product exporting developing countries. The Brundtland hypothesis about the link between the terms of trade and the environment is as follows. If the terms of trade decline, exporting countries must export more and more just to maintain foreign exchange earnings constant. In the specific case of crop exports, then emphasis is placed on expanding acreage in order to increase exports. If the affected crops are environmentally hazardous, groundnuts or maize, soils in land that is not marginal may be directly damaged. Damage to marginal soils would be even higher. Even if the crops are environmentally benign, efforts might be made to expand cultivation onto marginal lands by clearing serve and forest land and aiding to potential erosion through deforestation. The vagaries of trade and the fluctuating exchange rates are often shown to cause extensive environmental damage. Devalued, devalued currencies of many commodity exporting developing countries are shown as a major reason for increasing depletion of forests which are cleared for exports. The liberal trade in ivory during 1980s appeared to have depleted almost one-third of elephant population in Africa. Massive depletion of forests is attributed to pressure of free trade in hardwood, but the present phase of globalization with an emphasis on free trade would make the world's tropical forests unsustainable unless there are firm commitments. The growing dependence on exports seems to result often in inappropriate and environmentally damaging shift in cropping pattern. For instance, growing demands for cassava have made small farmers in Thailand to extend cassava cultivation into previously forested land. It is shown that cassava production for export is a significant cause of deforestation, soil erosion, and soil nutrient reduction in Thailand. There are instances of extensive environmental destruction unleashed by the corporate culture. The, the denudation of forest and with that of destruction of the culture of commons is widely known. The extensive and ruthless ecological damage done to the Ogoni region in Nigeria by the multinational oil companies and the uprooting of the livelihood of its people are well documented. Perhaps one of the notorious examples of globalization facilitating polluting the hazardous industries in the developing countries. In the case of Union Carbide pesticide factory in Bhopal of central India, the methyl isocyanate (MIC) gas leak from this factory rendered several thousand people blind, one of the worst industrial tragedies of the last century. These experiences appear to strengthen the belief that unbridled globalization would cause growing harm to environmental sustainability. 3.3 Environmental Standards. The emergence of the World Trade Organization (WTO) as a major institution promoting globalization by reducing trade and investment barriers has brought the trade-related environmental standards into sharp debate. Environmental standards refer to restriction on trade in commodities which are not subjected to certain environmentally damaging limits in their production or exploitation. The environmental standards are stiffly opposed by the developing countries. These countries see the intervening of environmental and trade issues as a threat to their sovereignty and their economies. Their objections to trade measures to achieve environmental objectives are based on the following considerations. First, the ban on certain environmentally unfriendly activities like ban on ivory trade or ban on hardwood trade have always gone against the economic interests of the developing countries. Second, trade barriers for environmental protection cause adverse effects on developing countries. Exports for the following reasons. Number one, trade policy measures usually are not the best instruments for achieving environmental objectives. Trade sanctions do not directly address the root cause of the environmental problems. Number two, unilateral import restrictions are imposed following costly environmental standards, and such protectionist measures reduce income both at home and abroad, especially in natural resource rich developing countries. Number three, environment linked trade restrictions will lead to escalation in trade disputes, resulting in retaliatory and counter retaliatory measures. Finally, the environmental uses of trade policy are seen as inherently discriminatory. For instance, industrial countries had lower environmental standards at earlier stages of their development. In this context, it is important to note that the developing countries contribute disproportionately small amount per capita to global environmental problems. For instance, of the global emission of carbon dioxide, United States alone contributes to one-fourth. Also, differences in standards are a legitimate source of comparative advantage. They reflect differences in a nation's resource endowments, preferences, and abilities. We have to remember that environmental standards rise along with the rise in the per capita incomes, and there is no point insisting on higher standards at lower incomes. The non-trade measures like labeling exemplary gratia, dolphin friendly tuna would be friendlier. The outside pressure on developing countries to raise their environmental standards would be used by domestic protectionist groups to argue against their government's export-oriented development strategy. 7. There will be a threat to the WTO rule-based multilateral trading system. In the context of efforts in the context of efforts to liberalize trade and investment flows, any attempt to link environment and trade is likely to be counterproductive. As discussed earlier, there are strong objections to trade liberalization on the ground that they would lead to environmental destruction, that more trade would mean more output and more income, all of which lead to resource depletion. This would encourage the location of environmentally degrading industries to countries with lower environmental standards and fragile natural environments, and all these are feared to contribute to further environmental damage. Many developing countries see environmental standards as backdoor measures of protection sought to be imposed by the developed countries. In the globalization context, there is such growing pressure from different groups. A large number of environmental issues are emerging that require global multilateral environmental agreements. It is recognized that at least three broad classes of environmental issues require international solutions. Firstly, there are regional problems arising when neighboring countries share a common resource and one country's actions therefore affect others. In this category, we deal with most problems of transboundary pollution, including acid rain and the management of international rivers or regional seas. Secondly, the world shares certain global environmental resources such as the atmosphere and the deep oceans. Any action by one country that affects such global commons has an effect on all other countries. In this category, there is a build-up of what we have called greenhouse gases (CHGs) and thinning the thinning of ozone layer by the emission of CFCs. Thirdly, there are resources clearly belonging to one country but have value for the international community not reflected in the market. They include they include tropical rainforests, other special ecological habitats, and individual species. We shall briefly discuss some of the global initiatives regarding these issues in the coming section.